The first thing we need to know about the inspector is that he is the proxy of J.B. Priestley, the playwright. He represents Priestley's views, and this is a political play, and so the views expressed are also political. As you probably know, J.B. Priestley was a socialist. And socialism is a belief in equality between the political classes, and in particular, socialists believed that the wealthy should not control the income of the poor. So factory owners like the Burlings would make a fortune out of low labour costs, and socialists believed that the profits of the business should be more fairly distributed amongst the workers. And indeed, many businesses were taken over by the government so that that wealth could be redistributed more fairly. But of course, the political message would never be heard unless the play was an entertainment. This is a picture of Alistair Sim playing the inspector in the film, and it's difficult to believe now when you're watching something in black and white, but entertainment is what this play was. And a major part of the entertainment is in trying to work out who the inspector is, what strange powers does he have, and how does he control the Burlings and Gerald in order to manipulate them into revealing secrets they would rather not have known in public. So here we go, this is the first description of the inspector, and he has a profound effect on the atmosphere when he arrives. The lighting changed from pink to brighter and harder, and this is symbolic. It's to show us how the inspector reveals harsher truths, and so the lighting is no longer rose tinted, if you like, pink and innocent. It's revealing their guilt, and hence harder. And that's the inspector's purpose, to reveal the guilt of the upper classes to themselves so that they will have a chance to change their ways. When you reread the play, you notice the ambiguity about him. Here, Edna points it out to us. He says his name's Inspector Gould, and when we replay this, knowing that he isn't a real inspector, suddenly the he says becomes much more meaningful. And he says it's important. Again, emphasising right from the very beginning that Edna might have suspected he was not a real inspector. And perhaps this is because Inspector Gould is on the side of the working classes. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's Edna who announces his arrival. It's Edna's clearly placed here in order to show that the inspector is her natural ally. Priestley hopes that the inspector will have a massive impression, which is why he arrives with this impression of massiveness. A massive impression on the characters in the play, but also on the audience whose minds Priestley wants to capture and persuade that socialism is the way of the future. And then this instruction here, that he must stare hard at the person he addresses, is quite unusual for a playwright to say exactly how the actor should behave, but because the inspector promotes Priestley's views, because he is Priestley's proxy, then Priestley is really clear about how he wants the inspector to behave. In order to be dramatic, the inspector's technique is to shock, but of course this is also Priestley's technique, and consequently we find that she's burnt from the inside out through drinking disinfectant. And this throwaway line, of course, is ironic. In other words, he's suggesting that this is the way the working classes are driven to behave by the rich. And that's emphasised again here, suicide, of course. and that is contrasted to the fact that she was in great agony. He's keen to shock the audience again. There is also a suggestion that the inspector is somewhat of a feminist. It's these young women that he's protesting about. He sees the lot of the working class woman as much worse than that of the working class man. And by focusing on the vulnerability of women, he hopes to make it easier to change the mind of his audience, both the real audience watching the play and the Burlings within the play. You will know that the inspector spells his name G-O-O-L-E, but this is a homophone for ghoul, ghost, and there is a strong tradition in literature taken up by Dickens in A Christmas Carol of supernatural visions of the future, and the ghost of Christmas future operates very much like the inspector here, and consequently he becomes interested when he finds out that Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Burling. He's very much interested in the future. And this marriage seems to be one of the main reasons for his visit. As we'll see at the end of the play, if Sheila accepts Gerald, then very likely there is no change, and the lessons that she claims to have learnt at the end of the play will be for nothing. But if she doesn't marry Gerald Croft, then there is a chance that the lessons have been learned. Many students struggle with this play and wonder why their English teachers bother to teach them it. They don't like having to watch a black and white video, and they very often don't get to go and see the play itself. And so it's for this reason your teacher has a moral purpose. All teachers really enter the profession hoping that they're going to make a difference. In other words, they want to make the world a better place, and they do that by trying to influence positively the young people that they teach. And this is a view that they share exactly with the inspector. If we were all responsible for everything that happened, said Burling, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? And the inspector's ironic reflection is, yes, it would be very awkward, but that's exactly how he thinks people should behave. So this is the socialist message that he carries, and it's one that most teachers feel, even if they don't vote for a socialist party, but they feel in terms of their responsibility to everyone they meet. And so another way of looking at the inspector is seeing him as a teacher of morality and moral values. Priestley also reveals that the inspector's purpose is not just to find out who's responsible for the death of Eva. He's here to expose the role of business. Burling tells the inspector that it's none of his business how he, Burling, runs his own business. It might be, you know, said the inspector. So this is a clear signal from Priestley that the inspector's purpose is also political. He's analysing the effects of capitalist business on the people they employ and by definition exploit, and they exploit them because of the low wages that are paid, which we can see here. The inspector characterises this exploitation as taking the earth. In other words, in this metaphor, the capitalists are destroying the very planet that we live on. And that's a message that's very current today. Many people speculate that the inspector just seizes upon information as he discovers it. But if we look at this stage direction here, where he says, "Are you sure you don't know?" and he looks at Gerald and then at Eric and then at Sheila, there's a strong suggestion that actually he knows each of their parts in the story of Eva Smith, or even 3 different women, which is possible. The alternative, that he doesn't know what they've done, is even more interesting, however, because then when he looks hard at these characters, he is assuming that because they are upper class, they are bound to have exploited the working class. And this is an even more powerful political point. It means that confronting any member of the upper class will reveal something that they've done that is evil in exploiting the working class. And that, if you like, is a more powerful way of suggesting that the upper classes are adversely exploiting the working class. And it's up to you to choose which interpretation of the inspector you prefer. Again, the inspector is really explicit about his purpose. I thought that it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we try to put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. And so you've got the contrast of the women's youth to the dinginess of the bedrooms that they live in. They're only at the back of the house because they're the poorest quality rooms that these women can afford because they only earn pennies. Again, emphasising how destitute they are because of the exploitation of the capitalists who employ them. The encounter with Sheila is really interesting. She reacts straight away, having seen the photograph, just as the inspector must have known she would, but her reaction, the sob and then running out, is perhaps more than he'd bargained for. The inspector puts the photograph back in his pocket and stares speculatively after her, and there's a sense that he's making up his mind here that perhaps he can use Sheila in order to support him. She becomes his ally at this point, but this stage direction suggests he didn't know that in advance. He perhaps expected Sheila to be just as defensive as Burling and Mrs. Burling turn out to be, but Sheila seems to offer him some hope. Now the inspector is quite blunt in delivering Priestley's message. Gerald has this throwaway line, "We're respectable citizens and not criminals," and the inspector counters, "Often, if it was left to me, I wouldn't know where to draw the line." And so he's making a really powerful point here, that the rich, because they are so powerful, naturally become criminal in their behaviour, because they're able to exploit people and get away with it. The inspector also has to compromise here. If we look at the death of Eva Smith logically, assuming that she is one person, then the sacking from Burling's factory has not led to her death because she had a good job at Millwards. But it's Sheila who gets her sacked from Millwards, and therefore it's Sheila who makes her go to the Palace Bar, where she effectively considers becoming a prostitute and then becomes Gerald's mistress. So actually the tragedy of Sheila can be directly traced, the tragedy of Eva can be directly traced to Sheila's actions. But the inspector doesn't say that. He says no, the tragedy is not entirely Sheila's fault. He needs to spread the blame across the other Burlings and Gerald. But interestingly, a logical approach would suggest that Sheila is indeed the most responsible for what happened. If she hadn't intervened, then Eva would still have the job at Millwards and would never have come across Eric and Gerald. We can see how difficult this compromise is for the inspector when he turns on Sheila and says it's the power that she had, that she abused, that has led to her death. And he emphasises that here. Yes, but you can't, it's too late, she's dead. He wants to accuse her, and so would Priestley. However, this would mean that the play would in effect stop here. This is where the buck would stop. But the blame needs to be shared because Priestley and the inspector is making a point about the whole of capitalist society. He's attacking the well-off, the rich. If he can make the rich understand why it had to happen, then they might change their ways, and that's why he's here. It's why he arrives in the play in the first place. And if we now return to the moment that the inspector arrived, we realise that it's Burling's own words that seem to have invoked him, called his presence as though he were supernatural. These are Burling's words, that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. And it's this very capitalist view that we are not responsible for our actions to other people, only for our actions towards our family, that brings the inspector to the house. This is when we hear the sharp ring, because this is the view that the inspector needs to attack and demolish.